I want to make money. I want Leaf to make money. Leaf wants me to make them money. So that certainly is important. But overlaying that with having the relevant experience, really caring about cannabis because you've seen it touch people's lives, and then you being a consumer yourself, I don't think it's mandatory. I could not smoke again and be, totally fine from a business perspective. But I think having that context of using the products, does help in this industry.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Jake, that's Duffy, and today we're sitting down with Jesse Redmond. He is currently the Chief Strategy and Investor Relations Officer at Leef Brands, but that title barely scratches the surface. Jesse started his career at Franklin Templeton. He was an early hire at Fisher Investments. He co-founded 2 hedge funds, allocated over $1 billion to hedge fund strategies, then one day walked away from it all. He closed his fund, he opened a dispensary in Santa Barbara, and he entered an industry where he'd never sold an ounce in his life. And he's since become one of the most respected cannabis analysts in the space. He's run his own consulting firm. He's led cannabis research at Water Tower Research. He co-hosts the Higher Exchanges podcast, and now he's gone from covering Leaf as an outside analyst to joining as an operator. Jesse, welcome. We're excited to have you.
Thanks, guys. Excited to be here. Was reviewing your library a bit before I jumped on today and saw my friend Patrick Ray had been on there. So I know it must be a good show if Patrick's on it.
Absolutely. Patrick was our very first investor way back when
Oh, really?
in 2018. Yep, we lived in Boulder, Colorado. We were just getting off the ground, and Patrick was the first person who believed in us. So we will always believe in Patrick as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, I spent 2 years at Boulder. I went to college there before I transferred out to UCSB and ended up in California. But yeah, love the Boulder area. Love Patrick as well. And as you guys probably know, I do a podcast called Higher Exchanges with Morgan Paxia, who works with Patrick now at Poseidon.
Absolutely. And yeah, what a great team. We had Emily on the pod a little while ago as well.
Oh.
And they're quite a duo in their own right. Well, I want to start off with a bit of the origin story. I want to go back to the beginning of your experience in cannabis because I think it's a really fascinating one, and it's a relatively unique one relative to a lot of people that I meet in the space. So you're running hedge funds, you're doing thousands of due diligence meetings, you're allocating a ton of really serious capital, and then your dad gets hurt. Can you walk me through what actually happened? The car accidents, the prescriptions, the moment that cannabis actually became a part of your life in that way, and how that actually got you interested in the space.
Yeah. So if we go back a ways, guys, I grew up in Minnesota. And when I was in high school, my dad was in 2 crippling car accidents. One on a freeway where somebody jumped the median and smashed into his car and pinned him against a bus. He started to get better, went to see his brother in Florida. Somebody ran a red light, T-boned the side of his car there. And ever since he was younger than me, guys, I am the ripe old age of 51. By the time my dad was 50 years old, he was disabled, had chronic regional pain syndrome, and never worked a day in his life. And the older I get, the harder that is to imagine what that must have been like to have been in the prime of your career, prime of your being a father, and had that all, I don't know, completely taken away, but severely compromised by those car accidents where people just smashed into him. That led him, down a life where he spent most of the last 35 years or so managing his pain problem. Going back, guys, when he got in that car accident, it was 1990-ish. You guys may not even have been around back in 1990, but state of the art back then was to prescribe a shitload of narcotics, morphine, Oxycontin, anything to numb or dull the pain. And they told us back then these things weren't addictive. They're going to be helpful. Take all you want. So my dad did that, followed doctor's orders, and over, a course of 20 years or so, built up a huge tolerance to opiates. And at one point was taking over 1,000 milligrams of Oxycontin a day. So now think about Oxycontin. I think the most popular dose is 30 milligrams. So what is that? 35, 40 of those pills a day. And that was to manage his pain problem. The guy was still in a ton of pain. And so I spent, my childhood, high school years watching this. Then I went to college. As I mentioned, I went to school in Boulder for a while, then transferred to UCSB, finished with a degree in economics from UCSB. And, I got introduced to really good weed when I was in Boulder. I grew up in Minnesota and didn't smoke any weed in high school. Went to, high school with a bunch of prep school dorks and really didn't start to spread my wings in that regard until I got to college, which I think is great. Like looking back, I think I have kids, and the older you are when you start smoking, I think that's great. And so I could watch this going on with my dad, his suffering. And I was always a recreational user where cannabis always felt better to me than drinking did. And the older I've gotten, the more, it's felt that way to me. But I never sold any cannabis and I just never gave the industry a ton of thought. But I consistently, would have some cannabis to relax with at night and on the weekends. And it was in the, right around 2015, my dad started seeing a cannabis doctor that a friend referred him to in Los Angeles. And over the course of a couple of years, he was able to get off 1,000 milligrams of Oxycontin a day and replace that over time through tapering with things like CBD tinctures, CBG, CBC, or other, minor cannabinoids that can be helpful. And he was smoking some flower too. Kind of funny. Eventually, he moved to concentrates for a while, and I had my 75-year-old dad with, a dab rig, with what's the electric coil, guys? Do you remember those back in the day? The coil that would
Yes, yes, totally. That
Nail or
like red
something.
hot wire, the e-nail.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly right. Yeah. And so he burnt himself on that a couple of times. So we had to eventually take that away from him. And now he has a volcano vaporizer that he uses for vaporizing flour. But yeah, that was the process, was the car accidents, the ramp and the opiates, learning about cannabis, using it complementary with the pain medication, then eventually wean himself completely off and use cannabis as his primary pain management tool. During this time, when my dad was going through all of this, I was pursuing a finance career. I studied economics in college. I worked at an investment management company in Santa Barbara when I was in college. And guys, I'm one of those people, I thought I always knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a portfolio manager. I wanted to be an investment manager. And so I did that in school. I interned. I moved to San Francisco, worked for Franklin Templeton. I transitioned over to Fisher Investments, made some career progress pretty quickly, and ultimately moved back to Santa Barbara, co-managed a fund called Santa Barbara Market Neutral Fund for a few years, and then spun out of there and started my own hedge fund called Evolved Alpha. And so I was pretty thrilled with, how the career was going for most of the time. I'd gotten some good breaks, worked hard, made some progress, but it never really had a deep, fulfilling feeling to it. I was involved in short-term quantitative trading strategies, a lot of computer-driven stuff, and it was a profitable thing to do, but it didn't feel like it had a lot of purpose. And so when I saw what happened with my dad, I thought more about my relationship with cannabis, and I looked at where the industry was going in California. We had Prop 215. We were heading towards Prop 64. I decided when I was right around 40 years old, a little bit older than 40, to put down the investment stuff and start my entire career over. And I did that by starting a dispensary just outside of Santa Barbara.
Wow. What an incredible journey. That is fascinating in a couple respects. I mean, the thing that really jumps out to me before we even really dive into your story in the industry is that pain management transition story for your dad. I think that it's so easy to talk about how cannabis could be a public health intervention in a sense by, reducing opioid prescriptions. We've seen some really interesting data. There was an article from the WAPO recently that talked about how, opioid usage dropped by 30% in localities in Michigan where cannabis was legalized and accessible. And it's very easy to talk about those numbers, but then when you hear and see firsthand such a meaningful personal experience of that transition, I can't even imagine what that was like to see from the outside and to then recognize, as you're looking for a career that feels more meaningful, oh, this is something that I could do that takes into account all of my skills, all of my knowledge, all of my capability as an operator that candidly, from the financial perspective is kind of missing from cannabis in a lot of arenas, and apply it to this place where I've seen how much of an incredible personal benefit it could have. That sounds like, that's like a storybook experience for a career. So I'm really impressed to hear that. That's awesome.
Yeah, I think the meaning and intent behind it is so pure, and I have a lot of pride in trying to do something better. Like I started a consulting firm, but I named it Higher Calling Consulting. Kind of a cheesy cannabis higher pun, like so many things, including my podcast, Higher Exchanges. But
You mean like our podcast, High
yeah,
Touch?
yeah, right. But the notion of a higher calling really meant something to me, and I'm proud of that part. But guys, I also like to be honest, right? And this has been so hard. Like The first few years running the dispensary were great. This was the end of Prop 215, and that was a good time in California. And by applying that work ethic and financial discipline, we made a ton of progress in a short amount of time and quickly became number one in our region on weed maps and grew really quickly. And that was great. But I thought, guys, coming into 2020 with the Biden administration, the Democratic sweep, that we were going to see a real boom on the investing side in cannabis. And so I put aside the dispensary, decided, why don't I take the 20 years of investing experience, the few years as an operator, and try to live at that intersection of cannabis and investing. And I was so early and so wrong about that. And so, I kind of think about it in two ways. One is the purpose behind it. I wouldn't take it back, but I also think when we have these conversations, I always like to just let people know that people like me have been struggling right alongside everyone else out there in the industry. Depending on where you've been, you've had pockets of a good year or two, but generally a lot of us have struggled to make this happen. And I admire people like you, and I admire people, Patrick, Emily, all the people that have, stuck through it over the last, 5 or 10 years, more in the case of, people like Patrick, Emily, and Morgan. And I just think it's important to kind of caveat it a little bit to say, like, this has been awesome and I'm so stoked to be here today, but also recognize, all the challenges and how hard it's been to end up where we are now. And I think right now in the industry is really where we're just getting started. Like, we'll talk, I'm sure we'll get into it, but the lack of political progress, guys, has been brutal. It has made this just so hard for all of us.
Absolutely. And, even more so, it's that uncertainty. There's, if it was, hey, we all know this is going to happen, but it's going to happen in 10 years,
Yeah.
then at least you could create some plans around it. But there's so much volatility that comes from not knowing. And when we look, we started in the industry around 2017, and it's really quite shocking to see how many folks who at that point had been in it for 5 years or 10 years are now gone from the industry. The early pioneers, they have, lost their businesses to a bankruptcy proceeding or receivership, and, or they've been consolidated by a bigger operator. Like, a lot of these folks have really had to transition out of the industry because they were too early and entered at, maybe the wrong time, and, found themselves in a really challenging position. So I really appreciate you calling that out, because a lot of people from the outside looking in think, when I say, oh, Jake and I founded a cannabis, ancillary company, they say, oh, that must be great money. You must be doing great. I see dispensaries all over the place. Like, yeah, well, unfortunately, literally no one has made money in the industry yet.
Yeah.
But, there's a hope.
Yep. Yeah, totally agree. I think cannabis has to mean something for you to end up still being here. Like, I look at people who used to be cannabis analysts and peers in that space. One of them now, works for a nicotine company. One of them now works for a coffee company. Like, people have had to tap out, right, guys? Like, how many years can you make this little money for, especially if you came from another industry, you got into cannabis, like maybe you had, a couple years you could do it. 5 years is a long time not to make much money. You guys mentioned, 8 years in your case. And I'm sure you've had, your periods that have been, some better, some worse. But I think you have to really care to be here at this point, because the financial opportunity hasn't been here. And maybe that's been painful and kicked some people out. I still wish we're here. But I feel like all of us, like guys talking today, like, the good part about it is I know if you're here now, you're here for the pure reasons. You're not here for the money chasing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said.
100%. I'd love to get back into the operations side of things and that jump that you made into retail. I'd love to hear about that first day on the job, first week on the job. You mentioned Patrick, who we both know well, and something that Patrick kind of talks about a lot is operators coming in from other industries or with finance backgrounds, and they have a tool belt from previous careers, and they look down for their hammer and their wrench that they're so accustomed to having in previous roles, and to find that in the cannabis industry, it's just totally not applicable. Tell me a little bit about that transition, day one, week one, what worked and what carried through from hedge fund in the world of finance, and what was, maybe completely new.
Yeah, I would say way more new than taking things that worked. I was used to working hard. I was used to financial discipline. I understood financial statements, and I think that's a huge advantage. Sometimes some of the legacy operators in the business have the huge leg up on the product side and really understand the cannabis business well. but they weren't trained in finance. They've been, growing weed in Humboldt their whole life. So they just didn't have access to that type of knowledge. And so I think there's pros and cons depending on which side you come from. But, I said at the beginning, like you said, I'd never sold an ounce of weed. I never sold a gram of weed. I never even split up a bag, right? Like I might have bought an ounce and I took half of it, but that was as far as, my weed selling acumen went. And so when I started the retail business, I had one friend in the Santa Barbara area who had a popular brand and had a farm in Santa Barbara. And he was an old family friend that actually was giving my dad cannabis to help manage his problems. And I went to him and I said, "Hey, man, I'm thinking about doing this. Can you help me out with some supply to get started? Would you work with me?" He said, "Yeah, of course." So, guys, here's what the menu looked like when he started. We had 7 strains of flower on the menu, all from one farm. We had 3 concentrates, 2 shatters, if you remember shatter back in the days, and 1 fancy live resin, because that was the coolest thing ever back then, and 3 homemade edibles that my mom baked. That was what the business looked like when I started. It was me running it, and my mom, who was her mid to late 60s at the time, was doing, most of the deliveries because delivery was huge in the 215 era, and that was most of our business. So we started, guys, with 13 things on the menu and me and my mom doing it. I would go with her to sign up new people, meet the new people, do the paperwork that was needed to just start to build that relationship. And I did that with the first, 1,000 people that we signed up. It was me doing it. And then once my mom got comfortable, she would go out and do it on her own. And eventually we built that out a bit more in terms of a team, but kept it real close to the family. My sister helped with graphic design. She would help with deliveries when my mom was out of town. And eventually we just grew over time. We started bringing in, other vendors. We started, carrying things like heavy hitters and Kiva and, Punch and different brands like that. And eventually, we got to, we had 100, 150 things on the menu, but it was a complete and total learning experience. And thank God I had the good friend in the Santa Barbara area to steer me right and put me on some good flour, good concentrates right away so that I wasn't out there just kind of blindly trying to pick bags of flour myself. And then over time, just like anything in life, once you've bought, looked at 10 different pounds and made decisions, then you've, looked at 20 different pounds and you've looked at 100 different pounds. And eventually I had made buying decisions on, over $1 million in cannabis. And I could look at stuff pretty quickly and be like, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And also learn things like price points, right? And so in the area I was in, there was a very affluent customer base who might lean in towards the higher end indoor. Once rosin became a thing, kind of the connoisseur crowd over here. You had the middle ground, which liked the middle price points, but also very, very big was the value crowd. And especially that was perfect for where I was because there's a ton of sun-grown cultivation around me. So we did really well with outdoor and greenhouse, which is flower that I personally love, but hits that lower price point. And so we did really well, there as well. So I learned how to diversify the business by having different things on the menu, different price points, different categories, different promotions. Like one thing that I did to get started on Weed Maps and do really well was somebody would order, I would follow up to see how their experience was, make sure they were happy, and say, "Oh, if you would like to leave a review on Weed Maps, we'll give you a free pre-roll with your next order." Pre-roll cost me about $3 in terms of my costs, but it got us that review on Weed Maps with 5 stars. And that's what kept moving us up the Weed Maps rankings. I knew nothing about promotions, guys. I'm not saying that was super clever. I'm just sharing that's one basic thing that worked. One other kind of funny thing I'll tell you is I found that people love getting free stuff. Like people love just getting a little free something, but giving away pre-rolls, if you have a $3 or $4 cost and it's a $50 order, you're getting up to 7-8% of your cost in terms of giving something away. So I had this idea where I was like, what happens after somebody smokes our weed? Well, I envision they're chilling on the couch and they're going to get the munchies, right? They're going to be looking for something to eat at some point. I can almost guarantee you. So I replaced the $3 or $4 pre-roll with a 50-cent candy treat or Hostess, or we had healthier options as well. We even had, a diabetic patient. So we bought some sugar-free things to give out depending on what people liked. But that idea of throwing a little something extra and doing it on the food side was something that people eventually just completely loved. They got tons of reviews on that as well. They're like, I didn't really understand why Green Door gave me, a Snickers with my order. But an hour later, it sure made a lot more sense to me. So those are some of the tips and tricks I learned along the way.
That is
That's
really
surprise and
incredible.
delight.
Yeah, I love that surprise and delight mentality. That's exactly right. And it's a reminder that all of these businesses are happening from the bottom up. I think from the, more financial or technological perspective of the industry are thinking, you know, okay, what are the monthlies on this dispensary? What do their COGS look like? What does that look like projected into the future? This, that, the other. What are the, all the different factors and levers that we could pull? But so much of building a great business is the same in cannabis as it is in other places. It's about really caring. It's about caring about the details. It's about thinking about that customer's experience from the moment they walk into the store to the moment when they're actually consuming the product off premise. And I have to imagine that's helped inform your not just experiences now, working with a company like Leaf, but also just generally as you observe and understand the industry. How has that changed your view, that like really boots on the ground experience that you have?
Yeah, I think it's been helpful both having the retail experience, having looked at so many different products and really speaking the language fluently. Like, I've been in the room with cannabis analysts who didn't know how many grams were in an eighth. And I'm like, hey, man, it's 3.5. And some people just aren't weed smokers. They're just, analyst guys, and they're great at the spreadsheets, but they don't really understand the product. And so I think there has been an edge and being not just having the retail experience, but also being a passionate consumer. And then I would overlay that with having the personal experiences. Like I mentioned, my dad's problems, but I also have a niece. Hi, Dylan. If you listen, sometimes she likes to listen to my stuff, and she has cerebral palsy and epilepsy. And so through her community, I've heard so many great hands-on stories about the seizures, the CBD. I recently had Bill, the CEO of Charlotte's Web, on our podcast, Higher Exchanges, to talk about some of the stuff and helping that special needs community. And so I think for me, it's kind of putting all of those things together. I love the finance part. I want to make money. I want Leaf to make money. Leaf wants me to make them money. So that certainly is important. But overlaying that with having the relevant experience, really caring about cannabis because you've seen it touch people's lives, and then you being a consumer yourself. I don't think it's mandatory. I could not smoke again and be, totally fine from a business perspective. But I think having that context of using the products, does help in this industry.
Absolutely. I'm curious, maybe now zooming out a little bit from that perspective. So, from the operator experience up back into that analyst world, the cannabis investing space, as we've talked about, has had all of its peaks and valleys. It has all of its business cycles within each individual state. What would you say is the snapshot state of cannabis capital right now? Where do we stand? I know there's a lot of questions on the horizon, but I'm curious, how you would describe this phase of the industry to somebody maybe who doesn't have as much experience with it.
If I'm being most honest, guys, I feel like we're stalled as an industry in many ways.
Mm.
I wouldn't say that about Leaf, and I can expand on that later. And I wouldn't say that about some other companies in the industry. But if we're just looking more broadly, I think cannabis, when I think about it personally from an investment perspective, is a state-led growth story. We have 24 adult use states. I think eventually we get to 50, so we can about double the TAM in that way in terms of expanding to new states. So I think it's a state-led growth story with a series of hard-to-time political catalysts. So when I talk about political catalysts, I'm talking about things like safe banking. I'm talking about things like Schedule 3. I'm talking about things like federal legalization. I'm thinking things down the road like export and interstate commerce. And so that's the thesis in my mind, is that we expand revenue, we grow through the state-led growth story, and then we unlock value. We start to get more of a premium as these different catalysts come in. I missed one catalyst, which is uplisting, right? Getting to something like the NASDAQ would unlock a lot of value for these companies. And so, I think you were going down a road I liked earlier, which is what's the time frame under which this stuff happens? Because if this stuff happens quickly, like I thought in 2020 when, there's a Democratic sweep, that unlocks a ton of value in a short amount of time, and your return on investment is much higher. If we have the same destination, which I think we do, I think we get to that same spot with those catalysts unlocked and the growth from the adult use expansion. But if that takes 10 years rather than 5 or 15 years, that ROI completely shifts. And I feel like where we are in that cycle is that we've been stalled out. So we haven't had a lot of growth on the state side. You guys probably remember Florida failed, right? Pennsylvania continues to be stalled. Looks like Virginia is going to get over the line, but we haven't had many unlocks on the state side. And then there's been zero tangible progress on the political side. Now, listeners are going to say, hey, man, Schedule 3 is moving along. By the time this comes out, maybe Schedule 3 has happened. But to date, we don't have Schedule 3, right? We've started this we've started the process on it. And I put together some numbers earlier, guys. It's been over 3,000 days since safe banking was introduced in 2017. And it's been over 1,200 days since Biden initiated the scheduling review process. And so we have these periods where we think stuff's going to happen. We get excited, but stuff hasn't happened, guys. So it's left the industry pretty washed out from a capital perspective. The existing cannabis investors have doubled down 19 times and they're out of money. Most of the cannabis VC funds spent their money and haven't been able to raise more because the returns have been poor. And the other side of the pond, which is where I want to get over here, that's where the institutions are playing. And the institutions aren't going to let us play with them until we get some regulations in place. They want Schedule 3. They want safer banking. And then they'll say, cool, we'll come over to your side. You can go over there, whichever way you want to look at it. But the institutions would come. The problem, and what's frustrating to me, is that we've been struggling over the last few years to find growth in the industry. Debts have generally gone up. Companies, have gotten weaker. Air's out of business. Gold Flora's out of business. Forefront's out of business. Cannabis is effectively out of business. So things are dying in the meantime. What worries me is finally when we do get the reform, when we do get the Schedule 3 and the SAFER, which both of those things could, theoretically happen this year. I'm maybe not that optimistic, but theoretically that could happen. Investors on the big side of the pond, the institutional side, might come over and be like, oh man, this is a bunch of rubble over here. What happened to this space? And there's just going to be a few strong companies standing that I think will generate the real interest. So I think from an industry perspective, we're at a challenging time and we need some things to change to get back on that state-led growth story and unlocking those reform catalysts. But I think if I'm an investor coming into the space, I think it's a great time to invest because valuations are so compressed. And I think we're getting closer to those unlocks on the catalyst side. But I think because of the damage that has taken place over the last few years, you need to be very selective about where you invest and find companies that aren't upside down in their balance sheets and have a meaningful growth trajectory ahead. And in my mind, that comes down these days to just a handful of names.
Sure. How do you think the proliferation of hemp and Delta 8, 9, 10 THCA has impacted both the policy aspect, but also the cultural sentiment about cannabis and marijuana?
Yeah, I think it's been terrible, guys. The vagueness in the 2018, Farm Bill has been exploited, for maximum profit in ways that I'm not cool with. Like all the synthetics, I have no interest in. I have two kids, 16 and 18 years old, and I do not want any of these cannabis products getting into their hands, especially the black market stuff, the intoxicating hemp stuff. There's nothing wrong with Delta 8 as a cannabinoid. I've tried it. I don't think it's super interesting, but if people like it, that's totally cool. But so much Delta 8 is just complete garbage, pesticide ridden, especially the cartridges. I mean, smoking cartridges full of pesticides and garbage, that's just awful. And so I think that there's been a lot of damage done by the intoxicating hemp industry in two ways. I think one is damaging the reputation of cannabis by getting it in kids' hands, no age checks. I've ordered stuff online before to test it, and there's no age check. Just cannabis just somehow magically shows up on your door. That's not okay with me. I want over 21. Age gating is critical. I like to smoke weed, love it. Big part of my life, big part of my family's life. But as I mentioned, with my 16 and 18-year-old, the longer they wait, the better in my eyes. And I don't want the stuff getting to kids. So I think intoxicating hemp has blown it on that side. I love clean cannabis. We have this ranch where we grow cannabis that's really remote because we want to keep it as clean as possible. We're super passionate about that. I think they've blown it there by putting a bunch of garbage into these carts that are probably hurting people and sending people to the emergency rooms. And I think it has dug into the growth opportunity in cannabis. It's going to depend a bit on the state, right, guys? Because if you're in Texas and you shut down the intoxicating hemp loophole, there's no legal market there for those people to go into. And so I think you have to be a little bit selective in terms of where you apply that. If you go to Ohio, where intoxicating hemp is big, and you shut it down, that's going to flow back to the legal operators because they have an adult use program. So I think the flow through back to the legal industry varies a little bit state by state. But I am very enthusiastic about shutting down the loophole of intoxicating hemp. I am not against those cannabinoids at all. I think there's a lot of value in some of the things being produced there, but the supply chains and the way it's being distributed are completely unacceptable.
Yeah, I think Ohio is going to be a great case study to watch. As of last week, hemp is officially banned in the state. So we'll be looking pretty closely at those numbers to see where that revenue is flowing, and optimistically hope to see it go into the recreational and medical purveyors.
I'm curious, with all of those confounding factors, things like hemp flying around, things like market level regulations, federal level regulations. How are you, in your position as a strategic leader at Leaf, thinking about positioning the business in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term? Like, there's so much complexity. I have to imagine that managing investors on behalf of a cannabis business and managing strategy on behalf of a cannabis business is like, you're going into a deep cave with no flashlight. How are you guiding yourself and your team through that?
Yeah, so we have a lot of opportunity in front of us and a lot of things that we could do. We have a lot of optionality. And the reason we have this, guys, is because we bought a cultivation site called Salisbury Canyon Ranch about 5 years ago. And that's about 90 minutes away from me on the other side of Santa Barbara County in a little town called New Kiama. And we bought a 1,900-acre ranch, and that's about 3 square miles. So we bought a huge remote ranch that used to have an old organic wheat field on it. That was about 500 acres that had been dormant for about 45 years. And we purchased this because we wanted a cultivation site that was big, that could feed our extract business. We're not growing flower. We're not selling flower. We're growing to feed our extraction business. And we needed a remote site where there weren't any neighboring farms. And we're actually bordered on 3 sides by Los Padres National Forest, so we don't get drift from other farms. You may not know, in California, about half of the material we test that passes as flower fails when you concentrate it. Because when you concentrate it, you may 4x the THC, but you 4x everything else in it, including concentrating the pesticides. So we've been running around the state for years trying to find, material to run for concentrates. And like I said, about half of it, once we do a micro extraction and send it off to a lab, fails for pesticides, and we have to give them the material back. So we sought out this remote ranch bordered by Los Padres National Forest. We worked with the Santa Barbara County. We have a 180-acre cannabis permit. That's about, I think, 8.3 million square feet is what that works out to.
Wow.
So absolutely huge. I mean, our ranch alone is bigger than Curaleaf and Truliev's, entire cultivation footprints, to give you, some sort of an idea.
Wow.
Glass House is 5.5 billion square feet, fully scaled. We're 8.3 million. Different businesses, they get more cycles out of their farm, so not on pound-to-pound basis, not quite equivalent, but gives you an idea for the scale. I say all of this because when we were just an extraction company, we were struggling. We had 20, 25% gross margins and had all those challenges, sourcing material. Now that we have this farm with the 180-acre cannabis permit, we've done the improvements on the first 65, and we had 2 harvests last year. To give you an idea how that's impacted us, in the fourth quarter, revenue grew 39% year over year. Gross margins doubled to 46%. Positive adjusted EBITDA, and over $1 million in free cash flow. And that's because we started running material from our own farm that's clean, and we're growing, guys, for $8 a pound, which, if you know the industry, that's absolutely an insane number.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, most indoors, $400 or $500 a pound. Greenhouse, $150 COGS. We're down at $8 a pound. So this farm is really special, for our company and for the industry because of the clean cannabis moat and also that low cost moat. Where I'm going with this on the strategy side is that this gives us a lot of optionality. We just got an investment for $4.5 million from Aaron Edelheit and a group at Mindset Capital, and that's going to allow us to finish the farm. So by the end of the year, we're going to go from 65 to 180 acres, and we'll be pretty much self-sufficient using our own, running our own material in 2027. That has a lot of financial implications. When we source material, we pay anywhere from $20 to $50 a pound. We're growing it at 8, so you can start to see how that impacts margins. But when you talk about strategy and what to do in the industry, Our focus right now is to finish the farm in California and give us maximum optionality. When I talk about maximum optionality, I mean, number one, being successful in California. We could push, 50% or greater gross margins once this is done and have a fantastic cash flow in California business that has a lot of optionality. Optionality on things like interstate commerce. Is that 3 years away, 5 years away, hopefully not 10 years away? We can sell the same products that we might sell in California. Like in California, distillate's about $1 a gram. In other markets, it can be $3 or $5 a gram. Even if it's $1.50, the impact on margins, if you increase your costs and your revenue by 50%, are insane. And so we want to build a platform that can serve the whole country. And even closer, guys, which is kind of weird, is that after Schedule 3, it looks like there might be ways to export. And then we could export, distillate, live resin, rosin. We typically have over 100 SKUs on our menu, and we could, sell those into other countries, like the Germanys, the Australias, things in the EU. And even if those are somewhere like $2 a gram, that's a massive difference. So I'd say the focus for us at Leef is to finish this farm called Salisbury Canyon Ranch, get that fully built out to 180 acres. We might even be able to do another 100 acres there down the road. So really maximize that opportunity and then figure out what's the best thing to do with the output from that. If we just have to sell it in California, that's fine. And like I said, we can, do 50% margins, great cash flows just in California. But if you're an investor in Leaf, I would look at the option. I would say, great, you have this today, but then over here is the optionality of where that could go in the future. Your COGS stay the same over here or lower, but your average selling price could go up 50 or 100%. And that's pretty exciting to me.
Yeah, this is really illuminating because it's sort of highlighting for me how much of the economics of the cannabis industry are determined by the economics of cultivation. And people, the kind of more flashy area to focus on is what's happening at retail, what's happening with your brand, how are people receiving you out in the market. But if you are being forced to grow the actual product itself in a facility that makes no sense agriculturally, in a place that makes no sense agriculturally, it's hard for me to imagine turning a profit. So, what do you see the future of cultivation looking like and meaning for the cannabis industry? Because people have invested a lot of money in their cultivation infrastructure and their assets. There's a lot of MSOs that have some big balance sheet items that are like, hey, this is our big valuable cultivation. How do you think that's going to impact the future of the space?
Yeah, I don't think the future is what the past looks like. So the past looks like if you're an MSO, I'm in 10 different states. I have 2 million square feet of indoor cultivation spread across 10 different markets. And my average, cost to produce a pound might be something like $500. Puts a lot of pressure on you to sell that weed at a very high price, to match those COGS. It's also terrible for concentrates, using indoor material for concentrates rarely pencils. And so it's the regulations, the fact we can't move product across state lines that have led to this siloed cultivation strategy, which is inefficient in a whole bunch of ways, in terms of scale and cost, that's one of them, but also just in terms of growing great stuff, it's really hard, right? If you are awesome at growing weed in California and you are, Cookies or Jungle Boys or somebody who went to Florida, it's going to take you a year or two to dial in that Florida scene and grow, find strains that grow well in that humid environment and all the challenges they have. Now move that to Pennsylvania and try to do the same thing. So I think it's really hard to be consistent across markets. We've seen that. I'm reading Berner's book, The Story of Cookies, and I think they're a great example, right? They had really, really fire weed in California, especially during the 215 days. Then they tried to expand to other markets, and I think the things that they're selling in, some of the other states I won't call out specifically, it's been harder to replicate that recipe, especially on the flower side. Interesting. I think it's easier on the edible side and the beverage and the manufactured product side, right? If you're Kiva and you're making chocolate bars, with distillate just to make something up in California and in New York, I think it's easier to get that consistency with the chocolate and the distillate and whether ingredients go in on the edible side. But I think it's really hard to scale a flower brand in the same way. So I think that's what the past looks like, and those are some of the challenges. I think the future looks like the bulk of cultivation coming from the West Coast, specifically California, also Washington and Oregon, especially on the biomass side, especially on the concentrate side, the greenhouse, the outdoor side. And then I think that gets filled in patchwork across the rest of the country. And so if you're, a big MSO and you have 10 cultivation facilities in 10 states, I honestly think more than half of those become bowling alleys or pickleball courts. I just don't think they're going to make sense. But I think
Maybe
there
they can grow
will,
mangoes or pineapples.
yeah, something like that, right? They're going to turn into something else. But I do think that you'll still have some specialized cultivation, in certain states, certain companies. I think that craft market will exist, but I think the whole thing does shift quite a bit.
That's going to be quite a reckoning.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is. I think it is. I think it's going to take time, but I think it's going to be a big deal over time.
And do you see that as kind of part and parcel with a Schedule 3
In
decision, interstate
in what
commerce
way?
unlocking?
In what way?
The kind of decimation of those indoor cultivation facilities. And I guess I'm not fully educated on whether a Schedule 3 unlock would allow for interstate commerce.
No, I don't think so. I think it's possible, but I think it would take some additional legislation with that, whether something called like a Bondi memo, which would be something on the attorney general level, something like safer, something to go with it, something explicit. But no, I don't believe that Schedule 3 is going to unlock interstate commerce. I think Schedule 3, guys, honestly could happen today, tomorrow, next week. I think Schedule
Mhm.
3 is pretty close, but I think interstate commerce is going to be a ways away, whether that's, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I think that's kind of the range. 5 years, maybe my over under 10 sounds too long, but I don't think Schedule 3 is going to happen in the next year or two here.
Yeah, and you think that's just a kind of directive from AG, or is that something that states would try to advocate for, or kind of legislate on their own?
I think it's going to be tricky because if you're California, you want Schedule 3, you want interstate
Hmm.
commerce, like Leaf, right? Like we'd love to be able to sell our products in other markets. But I think you'll see some pushback from the operators in other
Certainly.
states, right? So if you're in Pennsylvania and you have, just to make it up, let's say hypothetically, Pennsylvania has mediocre weed and would get crushed by California competition, I think there's going to be some kicking and screaming there along the way, trying to keep people out. I think over time, much like alcohol, that gets solved in most states. But even in alcohol, if you buy wine in Napa Valley, there's, I don't know how many states there are, but you can't ship it to every state, but you can ship it to some states. So maybe cannabis kind of looks like that. And I think initially, maybe it's even like a regional pact, like Nevada, Arizona, Utah, possibly, even though Utah, isn't, adult use program at this point. Maybe that's served by the Californias, the Washingtons, and the Oregons, and that's kind of the trial block, and it takes more time, to expand into other states. And so I think if we've learned one thing, fellas, in cannabis, things take longer than we'd hope, right? They're also generally more expensive, but rule number one is it's got to take longer. And so I think that's a good expectation on interstate commerce. I think probably the path, guys, is Schedule 3 is a necessary condition for safer banking. Boris Jordan, CEO of Cureleaf, was on our show Higher Exchanges a couple of weeks ago, and he said explicitly this: Schedule 3, step one, then maybe we can parlay that into something like safer banking. There's been rumors about Trump having a descheduling committee that's going to start this summer to look at descheduling cannabis. That could be a pathway to some interstate commerce. But if I'm most honest, that seems really optimistic to me. Like I mentioned, we're how many days did I say? 1,200 days into this, rescheduling review, and I'm supposed to believe this summer we're going to start talking about descheduling cannabis. Like, sure, man, awesome if that happens, but I'm not super confident. So I try to be a little bit tame in my political expectations. I think Schedule 3 safer. If we want to look at descheduling, super awesome. Schedule 3 plus safer may get us to the NASDAQ or higher exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange. I was talking to the head of listings for the NASDAQ the other day about this, and it's going to be something like Schedule 3 plus safer. If you want to be real nerdy, there's an addition to safer called CLIMB, CLIMB, which is an acronym I don't remember, that would explicitly allow uplisting, which I think would be huge. So maybe we get the dominoes moving, man. Maybe we do get, over 12, 18-month period, Schedule 3 safer and uplisting. Like that would be freaking amazing. Add the descheduling committee on top and we're off to the races. So that world does exist, but I don't think it's realistic to use that as your base case. I would form your expectations and say, what if it takes twice as long? Am I still going to be okay? And base them around that. You can't base your cannabis business decisions around expecting reform.
So I have heard, at least in the technology side of things, the idea that the wall that exists around the cannabis industry people in the cannabis industry think of as a prison holding them in, but maybe we should be thinking of it as something that's protecting us from the things that will come in once that wall is lowered. Do you feel like cannabis operators are underestimating the risk of their businesses being overwhelmed or beaten out by the influence of the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, the pharmaceutical industry, these operators who might flow into the space as an opportunity once there's more regulatory cover for them to do so? And maybe that's more relevant for, point of sale systems where, Toast or Square could start entering into the market and create real problems a little bit more quickly than perhaps these, bev alc or pharmaceutical operators. But curious how you think about that sort of two-way door.
Yeah. Is it a threat or is it an opportunity? That's
Mhm.
the question I would ask. And I think I think it depends how you position yourself. So I don't know your business as well, so I'll speak to mine. Part of what we're trying to do with Leaf is to make ourselves as attractive of a dance partner as we can ahead of these things happening. So I'll give you an example. We've been looking to raise money to finish the farm, real high our ROI project. And in order to do so, we wanted to have the best balance sheet possible. So we had about 11 million in convertible debentures on our balance sheet that was weighing us down. And so we talked to all those investors and we were able to convert them from the convertible bond into equity last year and removed $11 million in debt on our balance sheet. So we come into this year looking like a lot healthier company. And guess what happens this year? We reconnect with the folks at Mindset Capital. They do a bunch of due diligence on us. And 2 weeks ago, we were able to close 4.5 million of up to $8 million in this round. And so I don't think it was just that one move we did to make ourselves a better dance partner that made the difference. But we also have been trying to make ourselves a better dance partner by building a better business. And that meant for us acquiring Salisbury Canyon Ranch, building out the farm, having the low cogs, driving our margins up. And so I think I can see in the near term how cleaning your act up to be the most presentable, most attractive made a difference for us. Now let's look at your specific question, which is when the CPG, the alcohol, the tobacco money comes in, is that going to be a helpful thing or is that going to be a threat? For us, we're trying to make that be a helpful thing because we want to have the most valuable cultivation facility, not just in California, maybe in the country or the world, by having this clean cannabis moat where we're growing pounds, last year at $8. And that's going to lead to us making a bunch of great, high quality, low cost concentrates. If you are, a big tobacco company, you're looking, how do I get into cannabis? Well, it probably makes sense to get into California because that's going to be the cultivation hub. If I'm going to get into California, those big tobacco players probably like low cost cultivation, understand outdoor growing because you don't grow tobacco hydroponically indoors. They're also going to look at stuff and say, do you have a moat? How can you protect your business? How are you different? And they may also say, well, why don't I just do it themselves? And in our case, we can now show them the farm, show them the value of the different moats that we have there. And then when the question comes to why don't they just do it themselves, they can't find a cultivation facility like this in California where you can grow great weed and not have the pesticide drift. So I think it depends on your approach to things. And if you are feeling scared, if you are feeling threatened, I would ask yourself the question, how do I position myself? So how do we build something so fucking valuable that those people are going to want it rather than squash us? And so on the software side, guys, build something so fucking awesome that they're going to come in and say, I can't reproduce that myself. Why don't I just buy this one and bolt it on? So I think that's the mindset I would take rather than feeling threatened to say, how do I get better?
Yeah, well said. Well said. So wrapping up here, maybe Jake, we can move into the lightning round with our last couple minutes.
Yeah, we can do some quick ones here for sure to take us home. You've done 1,000 due diligence visits probably in your hedge fund career. What's the single red flag that you look for when you're evaluating a company, cannabis or otherwise?
I believe that investing ultimately is more of a qualitative than a quantitative bet. And I don't think people should get as much lost in the numbers as lost in the people, because that's what's going to create the value going forward. So on the investing side was largely focused on quantitative strategies, but I spent more time interviewing the people that built the computer programs than looking at the computer programs themselves in many cases. And I think that applies to cannabis, where you can look at historical results, and I think that's helpful, but I would also look at the operators and have the mentality, I'm going to bet on the jockey and not the horse. And I think that great leadership matters, and that's the one thing that's true in cannabis and investing.
So focused on people still. You co-host Higher Exchanges with Morgan Paxia, like we've mentioned. Who's a guest? Who's a person you've had on that show who's really changed how you think about something, or has kind of shocked you with something they've put into your world?
Yeah, I think it's the more bearish people. We're going to have Jerry Deraviani back on the show. He's a partner at Bengal Capital,
Mm.
and they've been on the more conservative side of things, leaned into more low-cost producers, and have drastically, outperformed MSOS. And so I think there's no shortage of industry cheerleaders and believers, and at times blind optimism on the investment side. I'll raise my hand. I would call it blind optimism, but I've been too optimistic. And I hold that core view pretty closely, guys, about the state-led growth story and the political catalyst. But the time frame under which that happens has been the problem in terms of, my predictions, being correct over reasonable time frames. And so Jerry brings a different perspective, really smart guy, been more conservative, been more bearish on the space. So he's one name, that stands out to me. I always learn a ton from having Jason Wild on the show, executive chairman of TerraSend. I think him and Ziad are great guests. I think they're some of the best operators out there. So I always learn a lot from him. Boris was on the show, executive chairman of and CEO of Leef a couple of weeks ago. I always learn a lot from Boris. And if I were to say one thing, I think I've learned the most from Morgan. Morgan and Emily are people that I looked up to when I got into the industry, and I started looking at the cannabis investing side. I said, oh, these are the people over here that know what they're talking about. Throw Patrick on that team, throw Colin onto that team. And I think Poseidon is one of the best investing teams in cannabis. And I feel like I'm really fortunate that I've gotten to spend an hour. We do the show every 2 weeks. So, an hour every 2 weeks, I've spent hundreds of hours now, talking to Morgan about investing in cannabis. And sometimes we have great guests on the show, but we also do our solo shows. And so, yeah, I'd say I've learned from guys like Jerry that are more bearish. I've learned from some of the best operators like Jason, Ziad, Boris's of the world. But at the end of the day, I'd probably say I've learned the most from Morgan.
So you got the dispensary experience, the analyst experience, public company operations. If a young person comes to you and says they want to get into the cannabis industry, what's some advice that you tell them? What are they doing first?
I take those calls. I get a lot of LinkedIn DMs, people asking me stuff, and I try to be generous because, man, I was sure would have appreciated that, back in the day when I needed help. I think about it with my kids. Like, I'd love if someone offered, tried to help them out within reason. I hate the DMs that, like, let me pick your brain about, how to grow my, XYZ business. That I'm not as much interested in, but people looking to get into the industry, I love those conversations. Actually spoke to the University of Alabama's economics club a couple of months ago on a Zoom. They had like 50 kids out there in the economics club that were interested in learning about cannabis. So I have a lot of those conversations. And my answer goes back to where we started, which is like, what's your why? Like, why do you care? Why are you here? Why do you want to be in cannabis? If it's because you just are a stoner and like weed, that's probably going to be okay to get started, but that's not going to make it, a lasting thing for you. I was talking to my girlfriend actually about if my son would ever get into cannabis, and he's 16 and doesn't hopefully smoke weed, but maybe over time it's something that he could show interest in. And I was telling her, I think in order for someone to really be in the cannabis industry, that you have the most success, number one, if you personally like it, because I think it creates more of a connection to the plant. And I think two, guys, you have to care about the bigger picture here. Like, in my heart, I really care about cannabis. And I think the more cannabis, the better under the right framework with age gating, testing, and all those sorts of things. And when you've seen it change people's lives around you, it really anchors that why. And so if something takes a year longer, if you spend 1 year making less money than your friends, it's okay because you feel like in your heart, what you're doing is so meaningful, and you feel like you know where it's going over time, and it's going to be something that's going to be lasting and leave a legacy, not a legacy in an ego way. Look at me and how important I am, but a legacy in terms of like, how did you change the world? When you sign off from, this journey, what did you do to make the world a better place? And I try to focus that on my family, my friends, the community, but I also want the world when I leave it to say that Jesse pushed to help people with cannabis because he knows of stories like his dad, because I mean, so many people I delivered weed to, guys. There's a guy named George who was a veteran, and he was in Vietnam and was never the same after. And he used weed to quiet the voices in his head. But George was, a veteran and couldn't get money, from the VA for cannabis. So instead, they gave him Vicodin pills and antipsychotics. I found out George was selling those Vicodin pills so he could buy weed from us. And that's not the kind of shit I want going on, guys. Like, I want the world to be a better place where we take care of guys like George. We take care of guys like my dad. We take care of these special needs people, and we give people access to the plant. So I'm getting a little bit away from where we started on this one, but I think if you want to get into the cannabis industry, don't do it for the money. Don't do it because you're a stoner. Do it because you think there's something big here that can change the world and you want to be a part of that. And hopefully in the meantime, you can scale a business really cool like your business, or scale a business really cool like my business, and we all leave financially secure and have a lot of opportunity there. But that's not the reason to be here. The reason to be here is because you love cannabis and you want to make the world a better place.
Well said. Maybe perfect for our last one here. I think I already know the answer, but do you ever miss the hedge fund world?
No,
Yeah,
no,
I
no.
figured.
Um, I still get some of the emails to my Gmail account of like the different hedge fund indexes and things like that. And I really don't read them anymore. I have friends still in the business that I talk to in kind of high level, keep track of things that are going on there. But no, I found my place here, guys. Like, I don't really believe in destiny and life having a plan for you. But I feel like for me, it's kind of worked out that way, that I had that foundation in finance. I had cannabis showed to me at different times in my life. I had that close friend who put his things on our menu and helped us grow. And that I, partnered that with a bunch of perseverance, and I was able to really stick to it. And now I'm still using those finance skills. I've got a bunch of spreadsheets open. We just did a capital raise. We were structuring equity with warrants. We had a preferred deal. We were wrestling over interest rates and the premium at which it converted. So I still get that finance fix. I still have a stock screen that I'm looking at all the time. I'm working for a public company with, public tickers. So I still get that itch. Maybe down the road, I'll want to do some more investing stuff that goes outside of what I'm doing. Like, if I had more time and had more money and it was 5, 10 years from now, maybe doing some side projects, with other operators or investing into other things, kind of like Jason Wild does at Terra. He's executive chairman of TerraSend, but he also has JW Asset Management, which invests into a whole bunch of other businesses. So I might scratch the itch a bit that way. But to answer your question more directly, no, I don't miss it. And I feel so incredibly fortunate I get to wake up every day and do this.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to end. Jesse, where can people find you online?
Yeah, so I'm pretty active on the socials. On X, it's at Jesse Redmond, JesseRedmond. LinkedIn, same thing. And then I host the Higher Exchanges podcast. That's usually every 2 weeks, like I mentioned, with my friend Morgan Paxia, who I've learned so much from. We're going to have actually Jerry Deriviani, who I was talking about, as another person I learned from. He'll be on April 9th. So that's coming up. So yeah, find me X, find me LinkedIn, and do us a favor and subscribe to Higher Exchanges.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jesse. I recommend everybody go to Higher Exchanges. I listened to the podcast with Boris a couple weeks ago, and I found it really, really fascinating. I'm always getting some great stuff in my feed from you guys. That was Jesse Redmond, a guy who has had every reason to stay in finance and chose to bet on the plant that changed his father's life instead. What a story, from hedge funds to dispensaries to Leef Brands. Jesse, thanks so much for coming on and sharing everything with us. It was really an awesome time.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Really enjoyed it.